In Versailles, Marie Antoinette urged the use of force, but the king would not shed the blood of his subjects.
She must have felt devastated that nothing seems to be going right. Every step that's taken is the wrong step. Although, of course, her advice has been ignored by the king in pulling back the troops. She's failed to persuade the king to hang in there and be firm.
Marie Antoinette was more isolated than ever. Most of the court, including her favorite, Madame de Polignac, had fled abroad. The once crowded palace at Versailles was now deserted. In August, the Assembly produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a direct attack on the old order. It was only the prelude of things to come. The revolutionary mob rose again in October. This time, the women of Paris marched on Versailles. The Queen hurried from the Petit Trianon. It was the last time she ever saw her beloved house.
What they wanted to do was force the royal family to dismiss the soldiers whom they thought were everywhere, and get the king to finally agree to the constitution.
At dawn the next day, the women stormed the palace. The Queen just managed to escape via a secret passageway to the king's rooms. The frustrated mob slashed her bed to shreds. Given the chance, they would have killed her. Surrounded and humiliated, the king and queen were taken back to Paris. Still in a state of shock, they camped out in the disused palace of the Tuileries. And the Parisians, sporting the red, white, and blue badge of the revolution, celebrated their apparent victory, planting trees of liberty. After 18 months' virtual house arrest in the Tuileries Palace, the Queen found herself in an increasingly desperate situation. Her brother Joseph had died, and the new Austrian Emperor Leopold's comment, "I have a sister in France, but France is not my sister," brought little comfort. Aided by her loyal admirer, Count Fersen, she began plotting the royal family's escape from Paris. But the king's fears of civil war held him back until the summer of 1791.
The National Assembly had been drawing up a constitution. It was due for completion in July. Now, the king had not been allowed any say in drafting it, but he believed if he could get out of Paris to a region of safety, he could negotiate as an equal with the Assembly.
On the night of the 20th of June, Marie Antoinette and her family crept out of the palace by separate routes. They then left Paris, heading northeast towards Montmedy. The risky adventure soon turned into a tragic farce. The royal family was recognized by a keen-eyed postmaster, and their way was blocked in the little town of Varennes. The king and queen were surrounded and forced to return. It was a nightmarish journey, a coronation in reverse. Louis was heard to say, "There is no longer a king in France."
When she came back from Varennes, she wrote to Fersen, and she said that her trip had demonstrated to her that, quote, "There is not a single town, not a single regiment on which we can rely."
Louis finally accepted the Constitution in September 1791, but the Queen's continued opposition was well known. She was caricatured as an ostrich, unable to swallow the Constitution. Always an outsider, she had lost all faith in France.
She possibly always rather more admired the Austrians to the French. And of course there is, I think it's in 1792, where she does say, "I'm so glad I'm German." Not a tactful thing to say.
In secret correspondence with foreign rulers, Marie Antoinette desperately tried to raise the threat of armed intervention. hoping to intimidate the Paris radicals. Many of the radicals wanted war, hoping to unite revolutionary France against the threat of invasion by the Austrians and the Prussians.
The king and queen are very happy to endorse that call for war because they think actually France will lose that war and then the Austrians and the Prussians will come in and rescue them from the revolution.
In April, war was declared. France was now threatened by Austria and Prussia. It was a decisive test of the Queen's true loyalties.
She writes secret letters to the Austrian Netherlands so the Austrians will know which generals are where and what they're trying to do. This is, by any stretches, when a war is on, it's treason.
The king was coming under increasing pressure. The radicals challenged him to make a stand on a religious issue, the one area he would not compromise.
They set out to wreck the constitutional monarchy. And the way they do that is to pass popular legislation, which the king will have to veto, and therefore make himself more unpopular. And Marie Antoinette, to her string of other titles, is now known as Madame Veto.
There was a swift response. On the 20th of June, 8,000 people stormed the Tuileries Palace, determined to intimidate the king and queen. To placate the mob, the king put on the red cap of liberty, which had become the symbol of the revolution. Deeply shocked by the fury of the attack, the queen wrote to Count Fersen that she feared the horrors could well be repeated. Ironically, it was Fersen who inflamed the situation even further. He encouraged the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the Prussian forces, to send a manifesto threatening Paris with destruction if the king and queen were harmed.
So here is Brunswick making perfectly clear to the Parisians who their enemies really are and their enemies within, and what the enemy from outside is intending to do, which is above all rescue the royal family. So in many ways the Brunswick Manifesto seals the fate of the monarchy.
In the early hours of the 10th of August, 20,000 Parisians surrounded the palace. The Queen tried to stiffen Louis's resolve, but he was convinced his cause was lost. He led the pitiful little cortege of his family and his ministers out of the palace to seek refuge in the assembly. In the confusion, Louis had forgotten to give new orders to his loyal Swiss guards. They were slaughtered trying to defend the empty palace. The royal family were taken to the Temple, a medieval fortress that was to be their prison. The revolutionary pamphlets were increasingly venomous. Marie Antoinette was now the she-wolf, leading her wretched family into oblivion. At first, the royal family led quite a comfortable, if monotonous, existence imprisoned in the Temple. Their shared misfortune brought Louis and Marie Antoinette closer together. But outside, Paris was in ferment. Spurred on by fears of counter-revolution, the mob ran wild. 1,400 people were massacred during September. Among them was Marie Antoinette's loyal friend, Madame de Lamballe, who had returned to Paris to be close to the Queen. In the same month, the Revolutionary Army defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy. It was shattering news for the prisoners in the Temple. No longer afraid of